Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Gavin Lon Digital. I'm Gavin Lon. In the previous video, i.e. part 16 of this course, we created the functionality for the login dialog. Please view the previous video of this course before viewing this video. In this video, we are going to implement client-side code for a user registration facility, where the relevant user can enter specific information about the user into a registration form displayed within a modal dialog inside the user's browser. Through this registration modal dialog, the user can submit the user's entered information to the server and subsequently become a member of the TechTree web application. For content like this and much more, please consider subscribing. And please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description. The registration form will contain several form fields. For example, email address, password, address 1, address 2, phone number, etc. The two most important fields will be the user's email address, which serves as the user's username, as well as a password chosen by the user. During the registration process, the user must enter a username, which must be a valid email address, and the user must also enter an appropriate password. Once the user has entered valid information into the registration dialog and submitted the information to the server, the user will automatically be logged into the system. The user will then be able to log on to the system with the registered email address and password in the future. So by the end of this video, we would have implemented 3 levels of security for our application. We have an administrator who is a member of the admin role. If you haven't yet seen part 15 of this course, please see part 15 of this course where we manually added the administrator account to the system through an EF core migration. We have an ordinary member who is not a member of any role, but who has registered to be a member of the application. And lastly, we have a public user, who is simply someone who accesses the application and has not registered to become a member of the application. So basically, anyone can use the registration form that we are going to create in this tutorial to register with the application and become a member of the application. So the functional parts for our registration process are very similar in nature to the functional parts that we created for the login process. This means we can use the same ordered structure that we used to implement our code for the login facility for the registration facility. So we'll build the code for our registration functionality under the following headings. Let's create the _user registration partial view. This partial view will contain the code for our registration modal dialog. Let's update the _login partial view. We'll update this partial view so that when the user clicks the register menu item, which is a menu item in our application's main menu, that our custom modal register dialog will be presented to the user, as opposed to the default registration page provided by the identity system. Let's create the registration model class. This class will represent an MVC model that will contain the public properties denoting the form fields of our registration dialog. Let's create the registration form. The coding in this section of the tutorial involves creating the relevant form and form fields and wiring up the property fields that we'll create for the registration model class to the form fields presented to the user in the modal registration dialog. Let's update the UserAuthController class. We'll appropriately use the functionality in Identity's User Manager class to save the user's entered details to the system. Let's write the jQuery and AJAX client-side code. We'll implement jQuery code and use AJAX to asynchronously submit data to the server from the registration modal dialog and also receive data from the server. For example, feedback from the server regarding a user's attempt to register with the system. Let's create the _user registration partial view. So let's create the partial view that will encapsulate the code for our modal registration dialog. So let's right-click the shared folder in our default area, let's select Add, then View, And from the dialog box presented to us, let's select the list item labeled Razor View-empty. Let's name our new Razor View file _user-registration-partial. Then let's click the Add button. So we are now going to use Bootstrap version 4 to implement code for our registration modal dialog. So we don't need to write the Bootstrap code from scratch. Let's find template code for our modal dialog implemented with the assistance of Bootstrap 4. Let's type in Bootstrap 4 modal into our search engines. We can then click the link to navigate to the relevant web page, where we'll find the template code we can use to implement modal dialog functionality. Let's test the code to see if this is the front-end functionality we want for our modal dialog. Great, that'll do. So let's copy this code to our clipboards. Let's paste it into our new partial view that we named _user-registration-partial. Let's cut the parent div element here and don't forget to remove the closing div tag. Then let's paste the div element that we have saved to our clipboards into the index view contained within our home folder in the default area. Let's write code to close the relevant div tag. Let's set the ID attribute for this div tag to UserRegistration.model. Then let's write code to render the _user-registration-partial view, which contains the modal dialog code, within the div element that we have just pasted into our index view. You'll see later when we implement our asynchronous code why we are writing the code in this way. Basically, it is so that we can target this div element in order to replace the contents contained within the div element with HTML returned from the server after the user has attempted to register with the system. So we will be able to update the contents of this div element asynchronously through the use of jQuery code. We'll see the details of this later in the tutorial. Let's update the registration menu item. So let's open the logon partial view from within the shared directory within the default area. This partial view contains the registration, login, and logout menu items that appear to the user in the main menu. So in order to wire up our registration modal dialog functionality, as it were, to the register anchor tag that denotes the register menu item, let's add an attribute named data-toggle and set its value to modal. Let's then add another attribute named data-target and set it to the ID of the modal dialog we wish to show to the user when the relevant register menu item is clicked. So let's set the data-target attribute to #UserRegistration.model. UserRegistration.model is of course the ID value assigned to the Bootstrap modal dialog we want to invoke when the register menu item is clicked. Let's run the code to test this. So our modal dialog is now presented to us when we click the register menu item. Great. Let's create the registration model class. Once we have created the registration model class, we'll wire up our registration model class's public properties to the corresponding fields within our registration form. So to create our new registration model class, let's right-click on the models folder and select Add, then New Class. Let's give this class the name of Registration Model. So let's add the public properties to our registration model class. We'll then add relevant form field validation and labeling related attributes to the relevant public properties. Each of the public properties that we are about to include in our registration model will correspond to a user input field on the registration model dialog form. Let's add a public string property named email. Let's add another public string property and let's name this property password. Let's add another string property and let's name this property confirm password. Let's create a public string property named first name. Let's create a public string property named last name. Let's create a public string property named address1. Let's include a public string property named address2. Let's include a public string property named postcode. Let's include a public string property named phone number. Let's create a public Boolean property named acceptUserAgreement. And lastly, let's add a public string property named RegistrationInvalid. This field will serve as status output, outputted by the server to the client after an attempt is made to register a user. This field will indicate to the client whether the registration functionality performed on the server is successful or unsuccessful. If the purpose of this property is not clear at the moment, don't worry. You'll see the significance of this field when we write the jQuery AJAX functionality later in the tutorial. So let's add the appropriate attributes for field validation and field labeling. For more information on applying these form-related attributes to model classes, please view the 14th part of this course. A link to this video is available below in the description. Let's declare the required attribute and the email address attribute against the email public property. The required attribute indicates that a value must be entered by the user for the relevant field before the user submits the user's input to the server. Remember, these attributes are members of the system.componentModel.dataAnnotations namespace. The email address attribute indicates that the user must enter a valid email address into the relevant field before submitting the relevant information to the server. Let's declare the display attribute and give its name property a value of username. So this attribute means that the relevant field will be labeled on the front end as username and will not be labeled by default with the name of the property, i.e. email. So let's declare the required attribute against the password field. Let's declare the dataType attribute and pass the dataType.passwordEnumListItem to the constructor of the dataType attribute. This means that the corresponding input field will have its type set to password, which means when the user enters data into this field, each entered character will be appropriately masked. Let's declare the same attributes declared against the password public property against the confirm password public property, as well as an additional attribute named compare. So the confirm password property corresponds to a field that allows the user to confirm that the password chosen by the user is indeed the password that the user wishes to input when logging onto the system. In order to validate whether the user has entered the same value for the confirm password field as the value that the user entered into the password field, we have declared the compare attribute against the confirm password property. Note that the field name denoting the field to which the value entered into the confirm password field must be compared is passed as an argument to the compare attribute. Let's appropriately declare the required string length and display attributes against the first name property. Let's do the same for the last name property. So let's make address1 a required field. Let's say that there is a requirement that the user must enter a valid UK address into the postcode field. So we can use the regular expression attribute to declare a pattern to which the user's input must conform for this field. We don't have to write the regular expression from scratch. We can find it online, like this. A link to this URL is available below in the description. Let's perform a search for UK postcode. Let's copy this regular expression here and appropriately paste it into our code, like this. So let's say there is also a requirement that the user must enter a valid UK phone number into the phone number field. Let's go back to our useful regular expression website and perform a search to find an appropriate regular expression for the phone number field. So let's copy this regular expression to our clipboards. Let's declare the regular expression attribute against the phone number property and pass the regular expression we have copied to our clipboards as an argument to the constructor of the regular expression attribute, like this. Of course, you can use whichever regular expressions you like to implement your validation. So you can use postcode and phone number patterns for whichever country you like to implement your validation for the relevant fields. And that's it. We have created the registration model class. Let's create the registration form. So now that we have created our registration model class, we can create our registration form and then wire up our registration form fields to their appropriate counterpart public properties in the registration model class. So let's write the code that will denote our registration form in our underscore user registration partial view. So let's open the underscore user registration partial view. To wire up the registration model to the registration form, we need to strongly type our underscore user registration partial view by appropriately using the model directive at the top of our code, like this. So to do this, we simply type @model followed by TechTree MVC web application .models.registration model at the top of our code. So let's include a form tag within our modal dialog code. Let's include a div element within our form element that contains the ASP-validation-summary helper tag attribute set to model only. This means that error validation messages will only be displayed at the bottom of each input element. Let's include the registration invalid hidden text field that will be used on the client to indicate whether the user's registration attempt is successful or unsuccessful. You'll see later when we write the client-side AJAX code using jQuery how the registration invalid hidden field is used for this purpose. Let's include a text input field which denotes a field representing the user's email address. Note that a valid email address must be entered into this field as the user's unique username. Let's include a password field, which obviously denotes a field into which the user can enter the user's password. Let's include the confirm password field, which denotes a field into which a user must re-enter the text entered into the password field. Let's include the first name field. Let's include the last name field. Notice we are including a span element under each of the relevant form fields and appropriately including the ASP-validation-4 helper tag attribute in each of the relevant span elements. These span elements denote form field validation-related exception messages that will be displayed under each relevant form field when appropriate. Let's include the address1 field. Let's include the address2 field. Let's include the postcode field. Let's include the Accept User Agreement field, which will be a checkbox field. All of the other fields are text input fields. Note that we are appropriately wiring up each field to its corresponding property in the registration model class by appropriately applying the ASP-4 helper tag. Note that I'm not going to explain the details of the Bootstrap classes that we are including in our code here for layout and styling purposes. I've included links to content on Bootstrap below in the description under the Additional Information section. If you don't want to follow along with this part of the tutorial, you can copy and paste the code from GitHub. A link to the relevant GitHub webpage has been included below in the description. Let's give the button that our users will click to register their information with the application a name of register, and for good measure, let's give the register button an ID attribute and set its attribute to register. Right, let's see what our form looks like. Let's run the code. Great! So in the previous part of this course, i.e. part 16, we created a controller class named UserAuthController. We are going to create a public method within this class that will be responsible for registering users with our application. So let's open the UserAuthController class. Let's add a public method to our class and name it RegisterUser. So this method returns a generic task object that is strongly typed with the iActionResult type. For more information on the iActionResult type, I've included a link below under the Additional Information section below in the description. For more information on asynchronous programming concepts like async, await, and task, I've included a link to a video series created by this channel on C# asynchronous programming. Note that our RegisterUser method contains one parameter of type RegistrationModel. So firstly, let's initialize the registration model's registration invalid property to true. This value will be used on the client as an indicator as to whether the registration functionality on the server, i.e. the functionality we are about to create, completed successfully. Let's write the code to check that all field values sent by way of the registration model object have passed validation, i.e. have conformed to the rules that we established through declaring the relevant validation attributes against the properties of the registration model class. We can write code to check the model state object's isValid to ensure that all field values entered by the user in our registration dialog have passed validation. Model state is a property of a controller object and can be assessed from our UserAuthController class because our UserAuthController class inherits from the controller class. The model state represents a collection of name and value pairs that were submitted to the server during a post. It also contains a collection of error messages for each value submitted. So if the isValid property on the model state object is true, this means the code to register the relevant user's information can now be executed. So let's write the code to achieve this. Let's create an object of type ApplicationUser and set the relevant property values on the ApplicationUser object to the corresponding properties on the RegistrationModel object that have been passed into this method. Remember, the ApplicationUser class inherits from Identity's IdentityUser class. Our application user class extends identity's identity user class, i.e. we extended the identity user class by adding properties to the application user class. If you'll recall, in the previous video we created code where an object of type userManager is passed into the constructor of our UserAuthController class via dependency injection. If you'd like to read more on dependency injection, I've included an appropriate link below in the description. Within the constructor of the UserAuthController class, we set a member variable named _userManager to the appropriate userManager injected object. So we can use our _userManager object, which is derived from the userManager type, which is built into identity, to register a user. So let's write the code for this. So to register the user's information, we can use the _userManager objects, create a sync method, and pass in the user's information to the first parameter and the user's password into the second parameter, like this. We can assign the result of this line of code to a variable which is appropriately named result. We can then check the result object's succeeded property to assess whether the registration operation has completed successfully. So if the registration has completed successfully, let's set the RegisterModel object's registrationInvalid property to an empty string. This is how we are indicating to the client code that the registration operation has completed successfully. So if the registration operation is successful, we want code to execute that will log the user onto the system. So let's write the code for this. Then let's write code to return the client-side HTML code contained in the _userRegistration partial view to the calling code. So if the code has not completed successfully, we can add an error message to the model state object that will be displayed to the user on the RegistrationModel dialog. Then let's write code to return the _userRegistration partial view to the user, which will now contain feedback as to what went wrong when the user tried to register with the system. So if the code makes it this far, an error or multiple errors have occurred. The user will be able to assess the feedback provided on the registration dialog and then make the appropriate modifications to the user's input and attempt to register once again. Right, so let's apply the necessary attributes to our RegisterUser method. For more information on why we are doing this, please see the previous part of this course, i.e. Part 16. Let's write the jQuery and AJAX client-side code. The code pattern, if you like, is much the same as in the previous video, i.e. regarding using jQuery and AJAX to log the user into the system. So I'm going to go through this code faster than I did in the previous tutorial. So please view the previous tutorial's jQuery and AJAX client-side code section for more detail about the code we are about to write. Of course, you can simply copy and paste the code from GitHub rather than following along with me. So let's add a new JS file to the JS directory. Let's name this file UserRegistration.js. Let's create a jQuery function. So firstly, let's write code to wire up a click event to the register button on our RegistrationModel dialog. Let's create a function to handle the click event. Let's set a variable named URL to the location of the action method on the server that will carry out the registration operation. Let's write code to set variables to each relevant user input field. Let's write code to create an anonymous object to encapsulate the user's input. Let's write code to appropriately call jQuery's AJAX method. Then for the success property, let's create a callback function to handle the case where the registration operation completed without unhandled exceptions occurring. Let's write code to parse the data sent back from the server, i.e. the code contained in the _registration partial view. We can then write code to retrieve the value that was set on the registration model object's registration invalid property to check if any errors were flagged in code on the server. If has errors is true, we want code to execute that will display the registration model dialog to the user so that the user can once again attempt to register. The registration model dialog will contain feedback as to what went wrong with the previous registration attempt. We are refreshing the _user-registration partial view, i.e. the registration model dialog, within our browser, so we must wire up the relevant click event for the register button to this click event handling function. Let's write the code to ensure that unobtrusive validation will work after an asynchronous round trip to the server. So, if has errors is false, this means the user's registration attempt was successful and the user is logged into the system, so we can simply write code to redirect the user to the home/index view. To finish off, let's write a callback function pertaining to the error property of the object passed into the AJAX method. So if there is an error, let's simply log relevant exception information to the browser console window. Great, let's test the code. Great, the validation is working. but we forgot to reference the UserRegistration.js file on the home/index page. So let's do that. Let's run the code again. Great! Excellent. So one last thing I'd like to do is add some logic into the home/index view to distinguish between a user that is logged into the system from a user that is not logged into the system. Okay, let's run the code. Excellent. So to summarize, in this video, we created the _user_registration partial view to encapsulate the code for our registration model dialog. We updated the register menu item to invoke our registration model dialog when the register menu item is clicked by the user. We created the registration model class to encapsulate the data passed between our registration model dialog and our server-side controller code. We created a registration form within our registration model dialog and wired up the registration form fields to the public properties in our registration model class. We updated the UserAuthController controller class in order to add the registration functionality on the server. We wrote jQuery code and leveraged the power of AJAX to send data containing a user's registration information to the server asynchronously. We wrote code to display our registration dialog to the user after a failed registration attempt, so that the registration form presents feedback from the server as to why the user's registration attempt failed. The asynchronous nature of our code made it possible to display our registration form containing additional information to the user without refreshing the entire screen. Our asynchronous code only refreshes the portion of the screen relevant to the registration model dialog. For content like this and much more, please consider subscribing and please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and please share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you'd like to thank me by buying me a coffee, I've included a link to my Buy Me a Coffee webpage below in the description. It will be greatly appreciated. I really enjoy reading your comments, so please feel free to engage with me in the comments section. The latest code can be found on GitHub. I've included a link to the relevant repository below in the description. Thank you and take care.